This is Monica Perez, and we are back with part two of Frederic Bastiat's The Law. And it's just great. I've read it before, and man, it's jam packed. It's only 74 pages. I'm reading the free PDF off Mises. I highly recommend. Listen, we're chatting and stuff, and it's good to think of it this way, but just go get a copy. You could breeze through it in no time, and it's just chock full of critical ideas. So let's just hit it. Let's just get right to it. Pick up right where we left off. There are no chapters that I can tell so far, and this is where we left off. Mr. Montalembert, adopting the thought of a famous proclamation of Mr. Carlier, said, "We must make war against socialism." And by socialism, according to the definition of Mr. Charles Dupin, he meant plunder. But what plunder did he mean? For there are two sorts, extra-legal and legal plunder. As to extra-legal plunder, such as theft or swindling, which is defined, foreseen, and punished by the penal code, I do not think it can be adorned by the name of socialism. It is not this that systematically threatens the foundations of society. Besides, the war against this kind of plunder has not waited for the signal of Mr. Montalembert or Mr. Carlier. It has gone on since the beginning of the world. France was carrying it on long before the Revolution of February, long before the appearance of socialism, with all the ceremonies of magistracy, police, gendarmerie, prisons, dungeons, and scaffolds. It is the law itself that is conducting this war, and it is to be wished, in my opinion, that the law should always maintain this attitude with respect to plunder. But this is not the case. The law sometimes takes its own part. Sometimes it accomplishes it with its own hands in order to save the parties benefited the shame, the danger, and the scruple. In order to save the parties benefited the shame, the danger, and the scruple. Sometimes it places all this ceremony of magistracy, police, gendarmerie, and prisons at the service of the plunderer and treats the plundered party, when he defends himself, as the criminal. In a word, there is a legal plunder, and it is no doubt this that is meant by Mr. Montalembert. This plunder may be only an exceptional blemish in the legislation of a people. And in this case, the best thing that can be done is, without so many speeches and lamentations, to do away with it as soon as possible, notwithstanding the clamors of interested parties. But how is it to be distinguished? Very easily. See whether the law takes from some persons that which belongs to them to give to others what does not belong to them. See whether the law performs for the profit of one citizen and to the injury of others, an act that this citizen cannot perform without committing a crime. That is so freaking true. Abolish this law without delay. It is not merely an iniquity. It is a fertile source for iniquities, for it invites reprisals. And if you do not take care, the exceptional case will extend, multiply, and become systematic. No doubt the party benefited will exclaim loudly. He will assert his acquired rights. He will say that the state is bound to protect and encourage his industry. He will plead that it is a good thing for the state to be enriched, that it may spend the more and thus shower down salaries upon the poor workmen. Take care not to listen to this sophistry, for it is just by the systematizing of these arguments that legal plunder becomes systematized. And this is what has taken place. The delusion of the day is to enrich all classes at the expense of each other. It is to generalize plunder under pretense of organizing it. Now, legal plunder may be exercised in an infinite multitude of ways. Hence come an infinite multitude of plans for organization. Tariffs, protection, perquisites, gratuities, encouragements, progressive taxation, free public education, right to work, right to profit, right to wages, right to assistance, right to instruments of labor, gratuity of credit, etc., etc. And it is all these plans taken as a whole with what they have in common, legal plunder, that takes the name of socialism. Now, socialism, thus defined and forming a doctrinal body, what other war would you make against it than a war of doctrine? You find this doctrine false, absurd, abominable. Refute it. This will be all the easier, the more false, absurd, and abominable it is. Above all, if you wish to be strong, begin by rooting out of your legislation every particle of socialism which may have crept into it, and this will be no light work. Mr. Montalembert has been reproached with wishing to turn brute force against socialism. He ought to be exonerated from this reproach, for he has plainly said, the war that we must make against socialism must be one that is compatible with the law, honor, and justice. But how is it that Mr. Montalembert does not see that he is placing himself in a vicious circle? You would oppose law to socialism. But it is the law that socialism invokes. It aspires to legal, not extra-legal plunder. It is of the law itself, like monopolists of all kinds, that it wants to make an instrument. And when once it has the law on its side, how will you be able to turn the law against it? How will you place it under the power of your tribunals, your gendarmes, and of your prisons? What will you do then? You wish to prevent it from taking any part in the making of laws. You would keep it outside the legislative palace. In this you will not succeed, I venture to prophesy, so long as legal plunder is the basis of the legislation within. It is absolutely necessary that this question of legal plunder should be determined, and there are only 3 solutions of it. 1, when the few plunder the many. 2, when everybody plunders everybody else. And 3, when nobody plunders anybody. Partial plunder, universal plunder, absence of plunder. Amongst these, we have to make our choice. The law can only produce one of these results: partial plunder. This is the system that prevailed so long as the elective privilege was partial, a system that is resorted to avoid the invasion of socialism. Universal plunder. We have been threatened by this system when the elective privilege has become universal, the masses having conceived the idea of making law on the principle of legislators who had preceded them. Absence of plunder. This is the principle of justice, peace, order, stability, conciliation, and of good sense, which I shall proclaim with all the force of my lungs, which is very inadequate, alas, till the day of my death. If I recall correctly, he had tuberculosis and he was quite young when he wrote this. And I think he knew he was dying, and maybe that gave him courage. I don't know. I'll have to find a good little short bio of him to end up our reading of this. And in all sincerity, can anything more be required at the hands of the law? Can the law, whose necessary sanction is force, be reasonably employed upon anything beyond securing to everyone his right? I defy anyone to remove it from this circle without perverting it, and consequently turning force against right. And as this is the most fatal, the most illogical social perversion that can possibly be imagined, it must be admitted that the true solution, so much sought after, of the social problem is contained in these simple words, all caps: law is organized justice. Now, it is important to remark that to organize justice by law, that is to say by force, excludes the idea of organizing by law or by force any manifestation whatever of human activity. Labor, charity, agriculture, commerce, industry, instruction, fine arts, or religion. For any one of these organizings would inevitably destroy the essential organization. How, in fact, can we imagine force encroaching upon the liberty of citizens without infringing upon justice and so acting against its proper aim? Here I am taking on the most popular prejudice of our time. It is not considered enough that law should be just. It must be philanthropic. It is not sufficient that it should guarantee to every citizen the free and inoffensive exercise of his faculties applied to his physical, intellectual, and moral development. It is required to extend well-being, instruction, and morality directly over the nation. This is the fascinating side of socialism. But I repeat it, these two missions of the law contradict each other. We have to choose between them. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free. That's what I would say about healthcare. Liberals can't be for legalizing pot and socialized medicine because the medical system is going to tell you what you can and can't do. And very shortly after that, Bloomberg came out and banned sugary sodas and said it was because now everyone's paying your health care. Anyway, Mr. de Lamartine wrote to me one day thus, quote, "Your doctrine is only the half of my program. You have stopped at liberty. I go on to fraternity." I answered him, "The second part of your program will destroy the first." So he says, you stop at liberty, I go on to fraternity. And Bastiat's answer was, fraternity will destroy liberty. And in fact, it is impossible for me to separate the word fraternity from the word voluntary. I cannot possibly conceive fraternity legally enforced without liberty being legally destroyed and justice legally trampled underfoot. Legal plunder has two roots. One of them, as we have already seen, is in human greed. The other is in misconceived philanthropy. I would say exploited philanthropy, weaponized philanthropy. I mean, Ayn Rand used to call it altruism. That was her word for it. But it's how they sell it to the people. But they don't, I don't think that the people who thought of this and started implementing it meant it to be truly philanthropy. A lot of these high-level bureaucrats do smell their own farts, as they say in South Park, and actually believe it and don't understand that they're living off of that. They're living high on the hog off of their claim that they care about the little guy. Anyway, before I proceed, I think I ought to explain myself upon the word plunder. I do not take it, as it often is taken, in a vague, undefined, relative, or metaphorical sense. I use it in its scientific acceptation and as expressing the opposite idea of property. When a portion of wealth passes out of the hands of him who has acquired it without his consent and without compensation to him who has not created it, whether by force or by artifice, I say that property is violated. That plunder is perpetrated. I say that this is exactly what the law ought to repress always and everywhere. If the law itself performs the action it ought to repress, I say that plunder is still perpetrated, and even in a social point of view under aggravated circumstances. In this case, however, he who profits from the plunder is not responsible for it. It is the law, the lawgiver, society itself, and this is where the political danger lies. And I want to get to that in a second, but I remember, do you remember the Elizabeth Warren speech where it was under the Obama regime? And she said, this guy builds his factory, and what keeps his factory from the marauding hordes or whatever? The police who police the roads, whatever. I'm thinking he can definitely defend his own property. And that police function or the defense of property is such a minor part of what taxes are for. Well, if you look at the federal budget, and I haven't looked at a state budget yet. I probably should. It's probably similar. The federal budget is something like, if I recall correctly, it's like more than half wealth transfer in the form of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Now, Social Security shouldn't be a wealth transfer. It's because you paid into it, but whatever. That's what that is. That's a scheme. And then most of the rest of it is defense, very little of which can be argued to be essential defense. Say 300 billion should be defense, and it's way over $1 trillion, all in. So what he is saying is it's your wealth, they shouldn't take it. And what Elizabeth Warren is saying, this is a common argument, you wouldn't have that wealth if it weren't for the structure that taxpayers before you put in place. But I would also say with $36 trillion in debt and counting, not one thing has been paid for. not one thing. So nobody put those roads. We don't own those roads. No one has paid for those roads. We're paying as we go. And there's been such a level of dereliction of duty on that it doesn't give you a right to say you owe, because the money that was paid for them was stolen. Okay. And used on other things, or we wouldn't have debt, because the cost of roads and basic services, I looked at this, is so small compared to the whatever it is these days, 8, 9, 10 trillion dollars that the government spends. All the governments together. Because really the local stuff is where you pay for and receive most of the actual benefits that you would need to get to work. But there isn't very much they have to offer. Okay, so the political danger lies in the fact that he who profits is not the one who decided to plunder you. Okay. It is to be regretted that there is something offensive in the word. I have sought in vain for another, for I would not wish at any time, and especially just now, to add an irritating word to our disagreements. Therefore, whether I am believed or not, I declare that I do not mean to impugn the intentions nor the morality of anybody. I am attacking an idea that I believe to be false, a system that appears to me to be unjust. And this is so independent of intentions that each of us profits by it without wishing it and suffers from it without being aware of the cause. Any person must write under the influence of party spirit or of fear who would call into question the sincerity of protectionism, of socialism, and even of communism, which are one and the same plant in 3 different periods of its growth. Protectionism, that's tariffs. He's taking a hard shot on tariffs. Interesting. All that can be said is that plunder is more visible by its partiality in protectionism and by its universality in communism. Whence it follows that of the 3 systems, socialism is still the most vague, the most undefined, and consequently the most sincere. Be that as it may, to conclude that legal plunder has one of its roots in misconceived philanthropy is evidently to put intentions out of the question. With this understanding, let us examine the value, the origin, and the tendency of this popular aspiration, which pretends to realize the general good by general plunder. The socialists say, since the law organizes justice, why should it not organize labor, instruction, and religion? Why? Because it could not organize labor, instruction, and religion without disorganizing justice. For remember that law is force, and that consequently the domain of the law cannot properly extend beyond the domain of force. When law and force keep a man within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing upon him but a mere negation. They only oblige him to abstain from doing harm. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They only guard the personality, the liberty, the property of others. They hold themselves on the defensive. They defend the equal right of all. They fulfill a mission whose harmlessness is evident, whose utility is palpable, and whose legitimacy is not to be disputed. This is so true that, as a friend of mine once remarked to me, to say that the aim of the law is to cause justice to reign is to use an expression that is not rigorously exact. It ought to be said the aim of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it is not justice that has an existence of its own, it is injustice. The one results from the absence of the other. Okay. I think justice exists, but okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you don't really commit a justice, you commit an injustice. But when the law, through the medium of its necessary agent, force, imposes a form of labor, a method or a subject of instruction, a creed or a worship, it is no longer negative. It acts positively upon men. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own will, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiative. They have no need to consult, to compare, or to foresee. The law does all that for them. The intellect is for them a useless encumbrance. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. It's true. Yeah. I mean, he's right. You get stupid and incompetent. It's like I think that speaks to my idea of heirloom wisdom, where you can't. I heard Parallel Mike say on a show, when you give a society traffic lights, you can never take them away. It becomes a part of their fabric. They just can't live without them. Yeah, because we've lost the heirloom wisdom of right of way, which was real. When I was growing up, there were no stop signs in my town. You knew that the lesser road stopped for the larger road. As they fed into the bigger roads, you knew that your street was you had to stop at the end of your street. And I bet kids today don't know that. But it's because you've lost it. And that's what he's saying. And really, it's going to be hard to turn this around. AI ain't going to help. Try to imagine a form of labor imposed by force that is not a violation of liberty, a transmission of wealth imposed by force that is not a violation of property. If you cannot succeed in reconciling this, you are bound to conclude that the law cannot organize labor and industry without organizing injustice. When, from the seclusion of his office, a politician takes a view of society, he is struck with the spectacle of inequality that prevents itself. He mourns over the sufferings that are the lot of so many of our brethren, sufferings whose aspect is rendered yet more sorrowful by the contrast of luxury and wealth. It's true. He ought perhaps to ask himself whether such a social state has not been caused by the plunder of ancient times, exercised in the way of conquests. Yes, yes. And by plunder of more recent times, affected through the medium of the laws, both. This is why socialism is so unnatural to the United States, in my opinion, at least for the 19th century when this was happening, because we had land. People could just mix their toil with the soil and get rich without stealing it, without preventing other people from exercising their rights. Where I think it arose in Europe because the lords and the feudal system alienated people from the land, from owning the land they worked. It was heavy, I'm just going to call it heavy taxation to say that yours is what they yielded from their land. Where did they get that right to that land? Where did that feudal lord get the right to that land? I'd like to trace that back. And it very much feels like an injustice. If from what I've read, there was, it's very hard to say that guy and his family just kept working land to the point where he had to hire people to help him, so far in the past. Like, I just don't think it worked that way. I think they conquered lands and took them over. And, so they have beef there. I can understand it, because if you walk down London, you can see some things that were, they have leases that are 99-year leases. So an old family will rent a place for 99 years and then they get it back. I mean, what was the origin of that title? But he also says not only the plunder of ancient times, but plunder of more recent times through the medium of laws. And any restraint of trade, in my opinion, is a form of taking. I understand the antitrust stuff, but that can only be justified, if it can at all, in the context of the advantages that are given to one industry over another. So, like, I believe when I was in law school, I believe I learned that AT&T was given the right, like an easement, like eminent domain type stuff, to put their telephone poles up. So when they were sued for antitrust to share that, it's because they had benefited from restraint of trade imposed by the government. So we could get into if there's such a thing as natural monopoly. I don't think so. But yeah, so there are a lot of laws that result in that. Not least of which are drug laws and welfare itself, which disempowers people. Okay. He ought to ask himself whether, granting the aspiration of all men to well-being and improvement, the reign of justice would not suffice to realize the greatest activity of progress and the greatest amount of equality compatible with that individual responsibility that God has awarded as a just retribution of virtue and vice. Wow. Let's read that again. Equality has to be compatible with individual responsibility and the retribution of virtue and vice. Very interesting. If you go to Ron Paul's farewell speech in Congress, he talks about, after all the years he has concluded, I would say continues to conclude, that the greatest justice comes from the most liberty. And of course, he's probably read this 100 times. He never gives this a thought. His mind turns towards combinations, arrangements, legal or factitious organizations. He seeks the remedy in perpetuating and exaggerating what has produced the evil. For justice apart, which we have seen is only a negation, is there any one of these legal arrangements that does not contain the principle of plunder? Justice apart, not including justice, any legal arrangement that does not include the principle of plunder, I would say no. You say there are men who have no money, and you apply to the law. But the law is not a self-supplied fountain, whence every stream may obtain supplies independently of society. Nothing can enter the public treasury in favor of one citizen or one class, but what other citizens and other classes have been forced to send to it. If everyone draws from it only the equivalent of what he has contributed to it, your law, it is true, is no plunderer, but it does nothing for men who want money. It does not promote equality. It can only be an instrument of equalization as far as it takes from one party to give to another, and then it is an instrument of plunder. Examine in this light the protection of tariffs, subsidies, right to profit, right to labor, right to assistance, free public education, progressive taxation, gratuitousness of credit, social workshops, and you will always find at the bottom legal plunder, organized injustice. You say there are men who want knowledge, and you apply to the law. But the law is not a torch that sheds light that originates within itself. It extends over a society where there are men who have knowledge and others who have not, citizens who want to learn and others who are disposed to teach. It can only do one of two things: either allow a free operation to this kind of transaction, i.e., let this kind of want satisfy itself freely, or else preempt the will of the people in the matter and take from some of them sufficient to pay professors commissions to instruct others for free. But in this second case, there cannot fail to be a violation of liberty and property. Legal plunder. Absolutely. I consider public education a wealth transfer. When I examine where the taxes are spent, that's wealth transfer. That's not a legitimate function of government because I can't use the crappy schools here. So I had, out of our tax money, they pay for the schools, and I have to pay for my kids to go to school. So I'm just paying for someone else to go to school at the point of a gun. You say, here are men who are wanting in morality or religion. Oh, by the way, the kids are better off not going to school at all than going to the schools where they're indoctrinated and actually don't even learn to read and write or do math. But law is force, and I need to say, okay, so you say, here are men who are wanting in morality or religion, and you apply to the law. But law is force. And need I say how far it is a violent and absurd enterprise to introduce force in these matters? As I said, it's summer and I'm multitasking and taking care of my son's every freaking whim. And I have to respond to him or he will try to solve his problems on his own. So like he sent me a text recently when I didn't respond. I'm going to the store. Let me know what you need. I'm like, you wouldn't even be able to find your way to the store. So I have to respond. Anyway, as the result of its systems and of its efforts, it would seem that socialism, notwithstanding all its self-complacency, can scarcely help perceiving the monster of legal plunder. But what does it do? It disguises it cleverly from others and even from itself under the seductive names of fraternity, solidarity, organization, association. And because we do not ask so much at the hands of the law, because we only ask it for justice, it alleges that we reject fraternity, solidarity, organization, and association, and they brand us with the name of individualists. We can assure them that what we repudiate is not natural organization, but forced organization. It is not free association, but the forms of association that they would impose upon us. It is not spontaneous fraternity, but legal fraternity. It is not providential solidarity, but artificial solidarity, which is only an unjust displacement of responsibility. Socialism, like the old policy from which it emanates, confounds government and society. And so every time we object to a thing being done by government, it concludes that we object to its being done at all. Brilliant. We disapprove of education by the state, then we are against education altogether. We object to a state religion, then we would have no religion at all. We object to an equality which is brought about by the state, then we are against equality, etc., etc. They might as well accuse us of wishing men not to eat because we object to the cultivation of corn by the state. How is it that the strange idea of making the law produce what it does not contain, prosperity in a positive sense, wealth, science, religion, should ever have gained ground in the political world? The modern politicians, particularly those of the socialist school, found their different theories upon one common hypothesis. And surely a more strange, a more presumptuous notion could never have entered a human brain. They divide mankind into two parts. Men in general, except one, form the first. The politician himself forms the second, which is by far the most important. In fact, they begin by supposing that men are devoid of any principle of action and of any means of discernment in themselves, that they have no initiative, that they are inert matter, passive particles, atoms without impulse, at best a vegetation indifferent to its own mode of existence, susceptible of assuming from an exterior will and hand an infinite number of forms, more or less symmetrical, artistic, and perfected. Honestly, I think that the socialists have tried to make people, I'm going to say socialists because I want to keep with his nomenclature, but you know what I'm talking about. They've succeeded in, like, by dumbing people down to making them more like this than they ever were, and therefore more susceptible to this thing, which appeals to that type of person. Moreover, every one of these politicians does not hesitate to assume that he himself is, under the names of organizer, discoverer, legislator, institutor, or founder, this will and hand, this universal initiative, this creative power, whose sublime mission it is to gather together these scattered materials, that is, men, into society. Starting from these data, as a gardener, according to his caprice, shapes his trees into pyramids, parasols, cubes, cones, vases, espaliers, distaffs, or fans, so the socialist, following his chimera, shapes poor humanity into groups, series, circles, subcircles, honeycombs, or social workshops with all kinds of variations. And as the gardener, to bring his trees into shape, needs hatchets, pruning hooks, saws, and shears. So the politician, to bring society into shape, needs the forces which he can only find in the laws, the law of tariffs, the law of taxation, the law of assistance, and the law of education. But I mean, he points out that they act like men are incapable of governing themselves, yet that other men are capable of governing all men at once. I mean, these are classic libertarian ideas and classical liberal ideas. These are not radical, anarchist, um, exploited ideas, ideas that were, I mean, maybe, I mean, Albert J. Nock may say that these ideas were a ploy to get us to re-up with government or whatever. But regardless if you're minarchist, anarchist, whatever, it is true that men who cannot take care, these politicians aren't the best of us anyway. I mean, I could argue for an occasional good king as being trained to it, but basically, democracy is not going to get you there. It is so true that the socialists look upon mankind as a subject for social experiments that if by chance they are not quite certain of the success of these experiments, they will request a portion of mankind as a subject to experiment upon. It is well known how popular the idea of trying all systems is, and one of their chiefs has been known seriously to demand of the Constituent Assembly a parish with all its inhabitants upon which to make his experiments. I always thought maybe Greece was that. Like all the city-states were incubators of different types of government. And so maybe the experiments have all been done if we go back and look. It is thus that an inventor will make a small machine before he makes one of the regular size. Thus, the chemist sacrifices some substances, the agriculturalist some seed and a corner of his field to make trial of an idea. But think of the difference between the gardener and his trees, between the inventor and his machine, between the chemist and his substances, between the agriculturalist and his seed. The socialist thinks in all sincerity that there is the same difference between himself and mankind. No wonder the politicians of the 19th century look upon society as an artificial production of the legislator's genius. This idea, the result of a classical education, has taken possession of all the thinkers and great writers of our country. Wow, that idea is the result of a classical education? This guy is blowing my mind. To all these persons, the relations between mankind and the legislator appear to be the same as those that exist between the clay and the potter. Moreover, if they have consented to recognize in the heart of man a capability of action, and in his intellect a faculty of discernment, they have looked upon this gift of God as a fatal one, and thought that mankind, under these two impulses, tended fatally towards ruin. The two impulses of capability of action and faculty of discernment. They have taken it for granted that if abandoned to their own inclinations, men would only occupy themselves with religion to arrive at atheism, with instruction to come to ignorance, and with labor and exchange to be extinguished in misery. Well, that's what happens when you employ this collectivist stuff, which gets hijacked. Happily, according to these writers, there are some men, termed governors and legislators, upon whom heaven has bestowed opposite tendencies, not for their own sake only, but for the sake of the rest of the world. Whilst mankind tends to evil, they incline to good. Whilst mankind is advancing towards darkness, they are aspiring to enlightenment. Whilst mankind is drawn towards vice, they are attracted by virtue. And this granted, they demand the assistance of force, by means of which they are to substitute their own tendencies for those of the human race. It is only needful to open almost at random a book on philosophy, politics, or history to see how strongly this idea, the child of classical studies and the mother of socialism, is rooted in our country. That mankind is merely inert matter receiving life, organization, morality, and wealth from power, or rather, and still worse, that mankind itself tends towards degradation and is only arrested in its tendency by the mysterious hand of the legislator. Classical conventionalism shows us everywhere behind passive society a hidden power under the names of law or legislator, or by mode of expression which refers to some person or persons of undisputed weight and authority but not named, which moves, animates, enriches, and regenerates mankind. We will give a quotation from Bossuet, Bossuet, duet, Bossuet. He wouldn't pronounce the Bossuet. One of the things which was the most strongly impressed upon the mind of the Egyptians was the love of their country. Nobody was allowed to be useless to the state. The law assigned to everyone his employment, which descended from father to son. No one was permitted to have two professions, nor to adopt another. But there was one occupation which was obliged to be common to all. This was the study of the laws and of wisdom. These are the liberal arts because they're for free men. Ignorance of religion and the political regulations of the country was excused in no condition of life. Moreover, every profession has a district assigned to it by whom? Amongst good laws, one of the best things was that everybody was taught to observe them. One of the good laws was that everyone was taught to observe them, yes. Egypt abounded with wonderful inventions, and nothing was neglected which could render life comfortable and tranquil. Thus men, according to Bossuet, derived nothing from themselves. Patriotism, wealth, inventions, husbandry, science, all come to them by the operation of the laws or by kings. All they have to do is be passive. It is on this ground that Bossuet takes exception when Diodorus accuses the Egyptians of rejecting wrestling and music. How is that possible, says he, since these arts were invented by Trismegistus? I don't know my Romans. It is the same with the Persians. One of the first cares of the prince was to encourage agriculture, as there were posts established for the regulation of the armies, so there were offices for the superintending of rural works. The respect with which the Persians were inspired for royal authority was excessive. The Greeks, although full of mind, were no less strangers to their own responsibilities, so much so that of themselves, like dogs and horses, they would not have ventured upon the most simple games. In a classical sense, it is an undisputed thing that everything comes to the people from without. Here's another quote. The Greeks, naturally full of spirit, I don't know what this quote is. The Greeks, naturally full of spirit and courage, had been early cultivated by kings and colonies who had come from Egypt. From them, they had learned the exercises of the body, foot races, and horses and chariot races. The best thing that the Egyptians had taught them was to become docile and to allow themselves to be formed by the laws for the public good. Okay, so here's the first place where there's any kind of title heading or whatever. And it's just the capital word name, Fénelon. F-E with a little nuggy. N-E-L-O-N. Fénelon. Reared in the study and admiration of antiquity and a witness of the power of Louis XIV, Fénelon naturally adopted the idea that mankind should be passive and that its misfortunes and prosperities, its virtues and vices, are caused by the external influence that is exercised upon it by the law or by the makers of the law. Thus, in his Utopia of Salentum, he brings the men with their interests, their faculties, their desires, and their possessions under the absolute direction of the legislator. Whatever the subject may be, they themselves have no voice in it. The prince judges for them. The nation is just a shapeless mass of which the prince is the soul. In him resides the thought, the foresight, the principle of all organization, of all progress. On him, therefore, rests all the responsibility. That's why we have the AI action plan. That's what's happening. In proof of this assertion, I might transcribe the whole of the 10th book of Telemachus. I refer the reader to it and shall content myself with quoting some passages taken at random from this celebrated work. I'm sure it's not random, to which, in every other respect, I am the first to render justice. With the astonishing credulity that characterizes the classics, Fénelon, against the authority of reason and of facts, admits the general felicity of the Egyptians and attributes it not to their own wisdom, but to that of their kings. Here's the quote. We could not turn our eyes to the two shores without perceiving rich towns and country seats, agreeably situated, fields that were covered every year without intermission with golden crops, meadows full of flocks, laborers bending under the weight of fruits that the earth lavished on its cultivators, and shepherds who made the echoes around repeat the soft sounds of their pipes and flutes. Happy, said Mentor, is that people who is governed by a wise king. Mentor afterwards desired me to remark the happiness and abundance that was spread over all the country of Egypt, where 22,000 cities might be counted. He admired the excellent police regulations of the cities, the justice administered in favor of the poor against the rich, the good education of the children who are accustomed to obedience, labor, and the love of arts and letters, the exactness with which all the ceremonies of religion were performed, the disinterestedness, the desire of honor, the fidelity to men, and the fear of the gods with which every father inspired his children. He could not sufficiently admire the prosperous state of the country. Happy, said he, is the people whom a wise king rules in such a manner. I mean, enforcing contracts is probably a good thing for a king to do if he wants prosperity. But that's a natural, that's a legitimate function of law and protecting property, because you're contractually obliged to exchange of property, essentially, usually, or performing an act, which is, time is money. Fénelon's idyll on Crete, idyll, on Crete is still more fascinating. Mentor is made to say, all that you will see in this wonderful island is the result of the laws of Minos. The education that the children receive renders the body healthy and robust. They are accustomed from the first to a frugal and laborious life. It is supposed that all the pleasures of sense enervate the body and the mind. No other pleasure is presented to them but that of being invincible by virtue, that of acquiring much glory. There they punish three vices that go unpunished amongst other people: ingratitude, dissimulation, and avarice. As to pomp and dissipation, there is no need to punish these, for they are unknown in Crete. No costly furniture, no magnificent clothing, no delicious feasts, no gilded palaces are allowed. It is thus that Mentor prepares his scholar to mold and manipulate, doubtless with the most philanthropic intentions, the people of Ithaca, and to confirm him in these ideas, he gives him the example of Salentum. So we receive our first political notions. We are taught to treat men very much as Oliver de Serres teaches farmers to manage and to mix the soil. Montesquieu, quote, to sustain the spirit of commerce, it is necessary that all the laws should favor it. That these same laws, by their regulations in dividing the fortunes in proportion as commerce enlarges them, should place every poor citizen in sufficiently easy circumstances to enable him to work like the others, and every rich citizen in such mediocrity that he must work in order to retain or to acquire. Thus the laws are to dispose of all fortunes. The quote continues. Although in a democracy real equality be the soul of the state, yet it is so difficult to establish that an extreme exactness in this matter would not always be desirable. It is sufficient that a census be established to reduce or fix the differences to a certain point, after which it is for particular laws to equalize, oh my word, as it were, the inequality by burdens imposed upon the rich and reliefs granted to the poor, which is, of course, what we have, progressive taxation. First of all, the rich are not affected by it. Progressive taxation is an income tax that is paid by people who work, not the idle rich, not the people who live off investments. And the ones who are most productive, the professional class, they give 50 or more percent to the poor. For whatever reason, they're poor. I don't know, but is that justice? Here again, we see the equalization of fortunes by law. that is by force. So that was a line by Bastiat. Here again, we see the equalization of fortunes by law, that is by force. And then the quote continues. There were in Greece two. Oh, it's so funny because I was thinking of Greece. I was thinking, like, weren't the Petri dishes Greece? And here we go. There were in Greece two kinds of republics. One was military, as Sparta, the other commercial, as Athens. In the one, it was wished, and then he writes in parens, by whom, that the citizens should be idle. In the other, the love of labor was encouraged. It is worth our while to pay a little attention to the extent of genius required by these legislators, that we may see how, by confounding all the virtues, they showed their wisdom to the world. Lycurgus blending theft with the spirit of justice, the hardest slavery with extreme liberty, the most atrocious sentiments with the greatest moderation, gave stability to his city. He seemed to deprive it of all its resources, arts, commerce, money, and walls. There was ambition without the hope of rising. There were natural sentiments where the individual was neither child nor husband nor father. Chastity even was deprived of modesty. By this road, Sparta was led on to grandeur and to glory. The phenomenon that we observe in the institutions of Greece has been seen in the midst of the degeneracy and corruption of our modern times. An honest legislator has formed a people where probity has appeared as natural as bravery among the Spartans. Mr. Penn is a true Lycurgus, and although the former had peace for his object and the latter war, they resemble each other in the singular path along which they have led their people. In their influence over free men, in the prejudices which they have overcome, the passions they have subdued. Paraguay furnishes us with another example. This is still the quote. Society has been accused of the crime of regarding the pleasure of commanding as the only good of life, but it will always be a noble thing to govern men by making them happy. Those who desire to form similar institutions will establish community of property, as in the Republic of Plato, the same reverence as he enjoined for the gods, separation from strangers for the preservation of morality, and make the city and not the citizens create commerce. They should give our arts without our luxury, our wants without our desires. In defense of Plato, I would say, not enforce, I wouldn't say, but I believe like the medieval church was Platonic. I read that somewhere, and I think it's probably true, where they had the abbeys and stuff, and people went there voluntarily to get out of the poverty, and people were plucked among them for leadership and stuff. I think it was maybe Platonic, but it worked because it was voluntary. And that was destroyed, I think, by the Wars of Reformation, where the kings absorbed the land and the power and the influence, the property, and that cultural influence of the church. And that, I think, was all gone after that. I don't know. Vulgar infatuation may exclaim, if it likes, "It is Montesquieu, magnificent, sublime." I am not afraid to express my opinion and to say, what? You have the gall to call that fine? It is frightful. It is abominable. And these extracts, which I might multiply, show that according to Montesquieu, the person, the persons, the liberties, the property, mankind itself, are nothing but grist for the mill of the sagacity of lawgivers. Okay, now we move on to Rousseau. Let's see if that's... All right, let's do Rousseau, and then we'll get to the rest next time. Rousseau. Although this politician, the paramount authority of the Democrats, makes the social edifice rest upon the general will, no one has so completely admitted the hypothesis of the entire passiveness of human nature in the presence of the lawgiver. This is a Rousseau quote. If it is true that a great prince is a rare thing, how much more so must a great lawgiver be? The former has only to follow the pattern proposed to him by the latter. This latter is the engineer who invents the machine. The former is merely the workman who sets it in motion. So Bastiat says, and what part have men to act in all this? That of the machine, which is set in motion, Or rather, are they not the brute matter of which the machine is made? Thus, between the legislator and the prince, between the prince and his subjects, there are the same relations as those that exist between the agricultural writer and the agriculturalist and the clod. At what a vast height, then, is the politician placed, who rules over legislators themselves and teaches them their trade in such imperative terms as the following. Here's another, I assume, Rousseau quote. Would you give consistency to the state? Bring the extremes together as much as possible. Suffer neither wealthy persons nor beggars. If the soil is poor and barren, or the country too much confined for the inhabitants, turn to industry and the arts, whose productions you will exchange for the provisions which you require. On a good soil, if you are short of inhabitants, give all your attention to agriculture, which multiplies men, and banish the arts, which only serve to depopulate the country. This would happen naturally, dude. Pay attention to extensive and convenient coasts. Cover the sea with vessels, and you will have a brilliant and short existence. If your seas wash only inaccessible rocks, let the people be barbarous and eat fish. They will live more quietly, perhaps better, and most certainly more happily. In short, besides those maxims which are common to all, every people has its own particular circumstances which demand a legislation peculiar to itself. It was thus that the Hebrews formerly and the Arabs more recently had religion for their principal object. That of the Athenians were literature, that of Carthage and Tyre commerce, of Rhodes naval affairs, of Sparta war, and of Rome virtue. The author of, quote, Spirit of Laws has shown the art by which the legislator should frame his institutions towards each of these objects. But if the legislator, mistaking his object, should take up a principle different from that which arises from the nature of things, if one should tend to slavery and the other to liberty, if one to wealth and the other to population, one to peace and the other to conquests, the laws will insensibly become enfeebled, the constitution will be impaired, and the state will be subject to incessant agitations until it is destroyed or becomes changed, and invincible nature regains her empire. Okay, so here's Bastiat's comment on that. That was a little much for me to fully absorb what he was saying, what Rousseau was meaning. So let's hear what Bastiat has to say. But if nature is sufficiently invincible to regain its empire, why does not Rousseau admit that it had no need of the legislator to gain its empire from the beginning? That's what I was gaining from that, right? Why does he not allow that by obeying their own impulse, men would of themselves apply agriculture to a fertile district and commerce to extensive and commodious coasts without the interference of Lycurgus? Is it Lycurgus? A Solon or Rousseau, who would undertake it at the risk of deceiving themselves. Be that as it may, we see with what a terrible responsibility Rousseau invests inventors, institutors, conductors, and manipulators of societies. He is therefore very exacting with regard to them. Here's another Rousseau. He who dares to undertake the institutions of a people ought to feel that he can, as it were, transform every individual, who is by himself a perfect and solitary whole, receiving his life and being from a larger whole of which he forms a part. He must feel that he can change the constitution of man, to fortify it and substitute a social and moral existence for the physical and independent one that we have all received from nature. In a word, he must deprive man of his own powers to give him others that are foreign to him. Rousseau is ridiculous, though. That's me. But Bastiat says, poor human nature. What would become of its dignity if it were entrusted to the disciples of Rousseau? And with that, let's wrap this up and speak next time. We'll start with Renan. Yeah, this is a goodie. I mean, that was a lot. I might have to go back and listen to that one myself. But I think Bastiat is answering every philosopher whose BS is used to support what was obviously a big socialist tendency in his time and place. So thank you so much for joining me for this. And I shall see you next time. This is Monica Perez.